Malcolm, hello.
Hi, Gregory. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Very well. I'm very well.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Not at all.
Where are you calling from?
I'm in Ancrum, New York, about 20 minutes from Hudson, upstate New York.
Well, we're so thankful that you're giving us some time and participating in this series.
Not at all.
So I'm going to ask a series of very open-ended and very general questions that you could answer as you wish. Should we begin?
Yes.
So my first question is, what is your most vivid memory from childhood?
My most vivid memory from childhood is, well, it's one of my earliest. As a very small child, going with my parents to the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. I was probably 5, and we were living in England at the time. And when the guards marched by, I was so taken by their glamour and glory that I ran after them, leaving my father, um, wondering where I had gone. So imagine this huge crowd outside Buckingham Palace, and I was sprinting alongside. And God, I don't know how long I was gone for. My poor father thought that I had been abducted or something, but I think it was, the earliest manifestation of my wandering curiosity.
What was your first aesthetic awakening? The first aesthetic awakening?
That's such a good. I think it. I don't. I remember having reactions against things long before I had reactions for things.
Mm.
So, as a music is a good example. I remember that discovering music. My parents, we had a record player but no records, and then my parents went to the library and took out 2 records, which I remember to this day. A Gordon Lightfoot record and Bridge Over Troubled Water. And also a Peter and Paul and Mary. This is in the early 70s. And I remember, I literally hadn't sort of thought about music before then. And I remember not knowing what I thought of it. And I spent the next 10 years of my life just kind of listening at random to things and knowing what I disliked, but I couldn't have described to you what my musical taste was. And I feel that was replicated in other aspects of my life, that I knew what, I would come, for example, to rely very heavily on the taste of others. Just because if I liked someone, then I felt, well, I will agree with their taste. I didn't have an independent sense of it inside myself. And I'm not sure I still do. It's taken, is something, the aesthetic part of my makeup is quite undeveloped.
Who are your early influences when you're coming of age as a writer?
Well, William F. Buckley, believe it or not.
Wow.
When I was in high school, my friend Terry and I, because we were in socialist Canada, there was no room for rebellion to the right of the political spectrum. There was only room for rebellion. The only way to rebel as an adolescent, was to be a right-winger. So we decided we would become aficionados of William F. Buckley. And I collected every one of his books. He used to publish these collections of his columns. And I quite literally memorized, there's like 10 of them. I bought them all, found them all in used bookstores, and read them all, memorized all the jokes, and tried to write exactly like William F. Buckley. Remember, he had this famously ornate style.
Yes.
Long, complex sentences and highly idiosyncratic and erudite word choice. So if you were to read anything I wrote at the age of 14, it was a bad imitation of William F. Buckley, with lots of kind of arch attempts at humor. And but I wasn't, ideologically, I didn't really understand what it meant to be a conservative. And I wouldn't have I didn't understand the implications of that. All I knew was that this sort of aristocratic figure, William F. Buckley, was tremendously appealing to my 14-year-old self.
Is there a book or a writer that changed your life?
Uh, Changed my life is a strong word,
Yeah.
but I feel like every now and again I discover somebody uh, who kind of who just sort of reshapes the way I think. You know, recently, for example, Errol Morris, who I know you're pals with, who I literally, I'm embarrassed to say, he hadn't really registered with me until the last year.
Yeah.
And I've since consumed, I'd only watched one of his documentaries, which was the one about the Vietnam War.
Fog of War.
Yes, Fog of War. And then I have suddenly discovered, and I began to read his books, and there's something about the intensity and sheer sort of genius of his writing that I just blew me away. Before that, Janet Malcolm would have been a big influence. Another of your pals, Jeff Tweedy.
Yes.
There was a period about 10 years ago where I consumed all of Wilco and its earlier forms, just because I felt like when you listened to that music, you got a glimpse of him and his sensibility, which is so, it rarely happens in music that you feel like you know the person, you feel like you know the musician just by listening. And that was, to this day, I've only laid eyes on Jeff Tweedy once in my life, but I would almost consider him a friend of mine, as crazy as that sounds. I mean, I've never had a conversation with him except for like 2 minutes once at a thing. So it's like, that was and going way, way back, I would say that as a kid, I was really into English mystery stories. And I read, for example, every Agatha Christie mystery. And as like 11-year-old or 10-year-old. And those had a profound effect on my sense of how to tell a story and the importance of mysteries in storytelling.
Do you feel that your work is in any way autobiographical?
Autobiographical?
Yeah.
Not really. I mean, not in the sense that it's revelatory of my inner life or feelings. Right. It's revelatory of what I'm interested in. But I tend to be quite sparing in the things that I do that are explicitly autobiographical, except if I'm making light of myself. But I don't, there's a particular art to memoiristic things. Mm-hmm. And I never have felt that is my strong suit. And also, I don't feel I'm complex enough for that kind of examination. I think of myself as being quite prosaic in my interests. I can't imagine anyone would want to know too much about that.
What is the least favorite part of the writing process for you?
I don't have any anxiety about writing. So I'm a newspaper writer by training. I spent the first 10 years of my life writing for the Washington Post, of my career. Yeah. And the one thing that newspaper writing does is it drains any neurotic elements out of your approach to writing. It becomes mechanical. You have to. You'd get a story at, in the days when a newspaper actually had to come out, you had a hard deadline at whatever it was, 6:30, that you could not. If you didn't get your story done, it would not go in the next day's paper. I mean, so you would get a story at 2:00 in the afternoon, and you would have to report it and write it and edit it in the space of, they encourage you to get it in by 3 hours, right? You can't, whatever trace of artistry or artistic complexity lay in my writing before then was kind of extinguished by that experience. It's like I've just been doing all the stuff on Andy Warhol, and not to compare myself to Andy Warhol, but he's a commercial artist before he's a fine artist. And of course he has that approach to his fine art. He was doing the equivalent of what I did at the Washington Post for some period of his life. And that will, like I said, that will drain you of any pretense or preciousness when it comes to your work.
Is there a part you like the best?
The thing I do best is revise. So
is what?
To revise.
Revise. Right.
So when for my podcast, we have table read. I'll write a draft, then we'll have a table read, and 5, 6, 7 people will listen as I read it with all the tape, as if it was a finished podcast. And then we will discuss it for however long, half an hour, an hour, and assimilating and responding to that criticism is that's the part I think I'm best at. So I can, even if the draft is a C, I'm always confident I can move it to a B+. Other writers hand in an A-, and it remains an A-. They either resist, or whatever changes they make don't make it better. They merely make it different. I have some confidence that I can actually make it materially better.
How do you negotiate the line between reporting and storytelling?
Well, I'm conscious while I'm reporting of the fact I'm telling a story. So if I was to have a conversation with you like this, if I thought that this conversation was going to be part of some story, I would have a very different conversation.
What way?
Well, a conversation with a story in mind is a manufactured conversation. So it's a conversation where in the back of my mind, I'm thinking the whole time, what do I want Gregory to say? Not the specifics of it, but what do I want him to address? Right. What is the attitude that I'm interested in eliciting from Gregory? I'm interested in bringing out a certain side to you that can be obvious to my listeners or readers later on. So I'm tremendously interested in the things that move you emotionally, or I'm interested in eliciting some kind of spontaneous reaction that will be meaningful. A flash of, particularly, you're an artist. If I was interviewing you, there's always a moment with artists where you see in their face the joy that their art brings them. It is not obvious how to get that expression. Right. So you keep, what I would spend if I was interviewing you, our conversation doing is hunting for that moment when you wouldn't necessarily know that look was on your face, right? You can't see what's on your face, right? But right. I remember once having a conversation with, told the story many times, with my friend Steve Gagan, screenwriter, very good screenwriter.
Yes.
And he has a mode, I don't think he's aware that he does it, that I realized the key was getting him to analyze another script, not his own. A movie in the news, a movie in the theaters now that he'd just seen. And you would say, all you had to do is say, Steve, what did you think of that? Or you mentioned something specific. What did you think of the role that, Jake Gyllenhaal played in, whatever? And his face would undergo this transformation, and his voice would change, and he would speed up. And what was normally, he has a kind of relaxed, and all of a sudden you would see in his, like, the intelligence that is always there with Stephen would suddenly be present, not just present, like glaringly obvious in his eyes. And he would deliver this kind of unbelievable, like brilliant dissection of what he had just seen. And then when it was over, he would go back to being funny, chill Stephen. And like that, when I would see that, I live for that. Like that is the journalist, what the journalist want. Even when the journalist isn't doing journalism, that's what
That's
that's sort of why we do what we do.
hunt for.
Yeah.
So taken as a whole, what do you see as the central themes and preoccupations in your work?
Um, well, uh, I'm always interested in seeing the world through someone else's eyes,
Mhm.
which means that I'm committed to the notion that there is something powerfully individual and idiosyncratic about people's perspectives. So I start every examination of a subject with the assumption that the person who I am investigating or interrogating or chatting with um, is profoundly different from me in some crucial and unknown way. Um, many people I've noticed conversationally look for similarity. They understand an empathetic conversation would be a conversation where you discover common ground. I'm not interested in common ground. I'm interested in the opposite. The most exciting thing for me is to discover the extent to which someone does not see the world like I do. And I constantly, and that I find thrilling. And that theme, a lot of my writing is simply boils down to the unstated premise. Wow, I had no idea someone thought that, right?
Well, that's great. Who's your imagined audience? Is that something you ever think about as you're writing or after
Yeah,
you finish the book?
I do. Well, I have a kind of, I have anecdotal evidence from the world about who my audience is, which is always a source of amusement to me because, for example, if I were to, I don't know if I've ever told you this, but if I were to, and I've done this, I've sort of empirically investigated this.
Okay.
If I were to make a list of everyone who ever comes up to me and says something complimentary about my writing, and I would break them down sort of into categories, what you would discover is that well over 60% of them, maybe even 70%, are Black. And of those 70%, probably another 70% are young males.
Huh.
I have, for reasons I have no idea why, a powerful following among young males, to the point, young Black males, to the point where I can walk down the street and I can tell, I have a sense, that guy's going to come and say hello. I don't have any explanation of that, except for perhaps because I am myself of mixed racial heritage, that I'm a kind of role model. I don't know. But that's the most striking thing. But in general, I don't imagine my audience in categorical terms. I imagine them in kind of having a common sensibility, that they are like me, just people who are interested in difference and not similarity.
Is there a movie that makes you cry?
You mean other than Four Weddings and a Funeral? I know I have.
Other than
I
that's the one.
have. I have incredibly obvious. When it comes to movies, hopelessly sentimental, and just name the sentimental movie, and I will cry on demand in that movie.
Do you want to name?
Well, I mean everything about Richard Curtis. So Four Weddings and a Funeral, like Love Actually, Notting Hill. I mean, I actually have always wanted to do a podcast episode on Richard Curtis, who wrote all those, as the person who has made more people cry than any other person in history. I think he is the one who's made more. I'd like to examine that and figure that out.
You got to do that.
I think it'd be really fun.
So what are the things you do outside of writing that feed your creative process?
Well, I am someone, writers are either inclusive or exclusive with their ideas. I am inclusive. So if I have an idea, the first thing I want to do, even before I've done anything with it, is share it with as many people as possible, because to me, that's where all the good ideas come from. Is it, when I have an idea, my assumption is it's incomplete. even if it seems satisfactory to me, my thought is, oh, I must know only a fraction of what's. And so the first thing I do is run this idea by as many people as I can to get a reaction. So I just wrote a podcast episode where it's all about a particular aspect of art museums. And I had this particular observation about them, and I shared it back in the fall with, I believe, with you as well as others.
Yes.
And at one point I was in Holland on my book tour, and I shared it to this philosopher who I ran into in a bar. And he said, I described this phenomenon, and I said, I don't understand it. And he said, oh, I do. It's just like Smaug the dragon in The Hobbit. And the whole podcast episode is not about my idea. It's about the philosopher's version of my idea. It's about me realizing, oh my God, it's like Smaug in The Hobbit. So that's a beautiful example of why I think it's so important to tell people what you're doing in excruciating detail, because what you get back is you can never anticipate the value of what you can get back.
What do you think the role of criticism is in this moment of crisis?
Well, I don't know if I can answer it in this moment of crisis. In general, I've become increasingly uninterested in criticism, except in a very specific way. If it enhances my understanding of the artist's intentions in a way I couldn't have done on my own, I appreciate it. What I'm not, the whole idea though of the critic as gatekeeper is something that I've lost interest in. I feel like the informal networks that you can create to let you navigate art are better, particularly as you get older. And also, I'm not interested in knowing what's bad. I'm interested in knowing what's interesting. And I feel like critics get too caught up in passing these kinds of binary judgments on things and not interested. So a really good example was, I watched the show on Netflix called Black AF, made by Kenya Barris, the guy who makes Blackish.
Yes.
To say that I loved it would be an understatement. I think it's just, sorry to swear, but fucking unbelievable. And is it flawless? No, not even remotely. It has all kinds of, we could sit here and poke holes in it, but there's something, and I know that it was, some reviewers treated it very harshly, and I know many people I know tried to watch it and didn't like it. Fine. If you watch all of it, and if you think about it, you will be, I think, like I was, overwhelmed by it. I mean, it's just like weird and super interesting and so unusual in the kind of way he looks at things. And so there's an example where the kind of critical infrastructure we have to judge television is not terribly useful. What's useful is simply experiencing something with an open mind and plugging it into your existing cultural reference and just asking yourself the question, was my life improved by watching this? And the answer is mine totally was. I mean, it's like, I still think about like moments in that show. It's just so it was just so fantastic and full of such energy and life and hilarity. I don't know. So there's like I said, I don't read TV criticism. Why would I? I just watch it.
That's going in my queue. I'm going to watch that.
Going to watch all episodes.
All episodes.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it tonight, the entire thing. I'll get back to you on that. So that anticipates my next question, which is, what is on heavy rotation during quarantine in terms of reading, writing, listening to music?
I've been listening to lots of classical music while I work, which is not something I have done in ever. I've been reading lots of books about old Hollywood.
Wow.
Just read a book about the Mankiewicz brothers,
Yeah.
Herman and Joseph. One wrote Citizen Kane, one wrote All About Eve.
That's right.
I have a big book about Albert Speer that I'm reading next, Hitler's architect. But I've been working, like many people actually, I've been working much harder since this all started. And so my time available for this kind of stuff is diminished weirdly. And I've been, you know, I watched Black AF. I watched
Michael Jordan. Last thing.
Michael Jordan. Jiri Haji. I just started the joint Japanese BBC production, which is really good. So yeah, I've just been sampling this and that.
So I have one last question, and if you have time, we could open it up to a few students.
Sure.
So the last question is, what advice would you give the students in this moment of peril?
I mean, it's an opportunity to explore things you wouldn't ordinarily have time to explore. You know, I would just say that the most important book I've read in the last 2 or 3 years was a book by David Epstein called Range, which is this book about the power of the generalist and how beginning your education, whether you're an athlete or a, you know, intellectual or what have you, specialist artist, by building as broad a base as possible is the better path to. He's against early over specialization, and if we have a little interregnum here of 6 months or whatever it ends up being, it's a really beautiful beautiful opportunity to broaden your base. Just try and read things that you normally would never ever read, or watch things you would normally ever watch. You know, you would have made the best use of this period.
Great answer. So are you up for a few questions? Allison is the first.
Hi, welcome.
Hi, Allison.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming. Just want to co-sign what you said. Yes, Black AF is funny. I think it's a great show, and I have lots of thoughts about it. But my real question is, you talked about not having anxiety when you write. As someone who has tons of anxiety, definitely stemming from, you know, grade school and that red pen just like murdering my paper and trying to avoid it as much as possible now. I'm trying to get over it. What is your advice on writing, trying to getting over these fears and the white screen and all of that?
Yeah. Well, I would just say that the thing you have to understand is that, so I've been writing for, 40 years. And my first and second drafts have always and will always be bad. So the thing I always find with the young writers is you look at your first draft or your portion of your first draft and you say, this is terrible. Well, I think that too. It's always terrible. There's no way around it. Even the greatest writers in the world, their first drafts are terrible and their second drafts. The trick is not to dwell on that, but just to accept the fact it's going to take 5 drafts, right? You just have to be fine with that. That's the cost of doing business when it comes to writing. It is an iterative process, and your job as a writer the first time around is simply to put something down on the page that very loosely resembles what you would like to end up with. And I stress very loosely resembles, and then fix it.
Dylan.
Thanks for being here. Earlier you were talking about looking for a moment in journalism and storytelling and hunting for something. And I'm wondering, at what point does that feel like it turns into manipulation and fiction?
Yeah, you have to be careful. You're not trying to push someone in a particular direction, and you're not trying to telegraph their answers. What you're doing is you're trying to read their responses. So you could have asked me 10 different questions, and we could even do a little randomized trial where you run all 10 set questions by me, and they can all be honest questions that you have a desire to know the answers to. My interest level in answering those 10 questions will be highly variable. Some of them I'll be like, oh, I can't believe you're asking me that. Some of them will be like, That's a really interesting question, right? Now, are you manipulating me if you observe my reaction to those 10 and then follow up on the one that really got me interested? No. You're simply letting my excitement and enthusiasm guide your behavior as an interviewer, right? That's what I'm talking about. Now, there is a school of journalism. That's what you're talking about, and you have to guard against that. But I think I like to think of it more as very reactive. It's just like, if I've never, if suppose I'm interviewing you, I know nothing about you. I need to explore your interests if I'm going to create something of value in our interaction.
Dawn.
Hi, Malcolm.
Hi, Don.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I really like your work with revisionist history, and I was thinking about how you deal with history that's being debated while it's happening. And if you ever think about conspiracy theories, or if you've ever found value in them happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. I tend to kind of, let me back up and say, the thing that you discover when you do the kind of journalism that I do is that even things you think are settled are not settled. So in history, everything is constantly being unsettled. So there's always going to be some, a kind of inner conflict over what not necessarily the truth is, but what the kind of accepted story is. So the word conspiracy theory is simply a word that's used to describe the most extreme voice in any ongoing conversation. But what always strikes me is that over time, the people who wear the mantle of the conspiracy theorist changes. So I'm very it's not that I am prone to backing conspiracy theories. I don't. But I'm aware of the fact that our definition of what a conspiracy theory is highly subjective. It's based on where we're standing at this particular moment. Like I did a long, in the current episode of Revisionist History, there are a series of episodes devoted to the American firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945. And there's a million ways to look at that. And there are perspectives on that night that would have been considered unacceptable in 1945 that are totally legit now. So all of which is to say, I try to be as open-minded as possible about issues for which there's a diversity of viewpoints, because you just don't know which way the world turns in the next generation.
Izzy.
Hey, hi, Malcolm. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I want to say I really appreciate your answer in terms of criticism and your sort of reluctance to it increasingly. I think it's something as an artist I suffer with. It's probably the biggest block in terms of not pursuing anything because of fear of that. I want to say Inside the Third Reich, if that's what you're referring to, it's a great book. But the main question was, you talked about how you are outward in terms of your ideas, which I also intrinsically relate to. How do you not involve your ego in a way that sort of shuts you down from wanting to continue to share? And how do you pursue an idea even after receiving maybe criticism or feedback from a friend you really respect that maybe is not positive?
Yeah. Well, to my mind, that's the benefit of sharing from the get-go. And that is you because the story I'm telling, so for example, this thing that I was talking about with Gregory about the art museums that the Dutch philosopher told me is like smog. So I was obsessed with that idea for about, 3 months, 4 months. But the way I was talking about it, let's say I was obsessed with it from September to January. The way I was talking about it in September, was very different from the way I was talking about it in January. Every time I told someone about this particular idea I had, I changed it. I changed it in response to the way the previous person had reacted, or the thing the previous person had said or shared with me, and so the way I escape the problem that you're describing is by allowing my ideas to mutate.
Mm.
I think the most important trait that I have as a writer is my willingness to change my mind. I will change my mind about anything. I mean, it sounds kind of nihilistic, but it's the only way to be. You just have to be prepared to like say, actually, you know what? Yesterday I said that, 2 + 2 is 4. Today I believe it's 3. I'm fine with that. Until someone corrects me again, I'm going to go with 3, right? So I've come to kind of pride myself. To the extent I have ego in the game now, my ego is tied up in my ability to turn on a dime if someone can convince me. That's the thing that I'm most kind of pleased with about the way I deal with ideas. Now, it has its costs, but I think in general it's the right trade-off because it allows me to learn when someone says something that takes me aback.
Thank you so much.
Dana.
Hi, Malcolm. Thanks so much for being here. I'm a huge admirer of your work. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about how your relationship with running and how that might affect other areas of your life.
With running?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I'm about to go for a run after this is over. Just in the sense of that there's precious little time in most people's lives these days for reflection. And I think that art requires an enormous amount of reflection in my experience. Both because your mind needs time to process whatever that you're doing, and also you have to let your imagination kind of run wild if you're ever going to remain fresh. And neither of those two things happen naturally. They only happen if you create a space for it. And so when I run, I don't have things in my ears and I don't run with people. I just go for a run somewhere quiet and see what happens. And I just find it, I can't measure the value of that, but I'm quite sure it does have some kind of payoff in terms of allowing my imagination to kind of reconfigure itself in the face of the next challenge.
Thanks.
We have time for one last question, and that goes to Conrad.
Awesome. Hi, Malcolm. I'm a current undergrad and, of course, a huge fan. And I've taken note of how you're such an eloquent speaker, and I'm curious how you got like that, and any sort of ways that you would recommend either practicing or developing our speaking skills in order to become just a more eloquent speaker.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all. That was very nice. I can't take credit for my mother is someone who has both a beautiful voice and an extraordinary way of speaking. So she speaks very simply and incredibly clearly without any sort of unnecessary pauses, digressions, subordinate clauses. And that's the model that I grew up with. And also my writing has always been explicitly conversational. So when I write, I often talk under my breath and say the thing that I'm writing, and write only things that sound to my ear that they work, which is why I think the transition that I made from print to audio was as seamless as it was, because I was always kind of in the audio business, even when I was just writing for print. To my mind, the sensation I was trying to create in my readers was of me reading to them. Why I have that, I don't know. The last thing I will say is my mother was this model of beautiful articulation. My father and my brother were models of the opposite. They were the least articulate. And they were, to this day, my brother speaks in such convoluted that as a child, I remember I would listen to him and I would want to shout at him, no, you're saying it all wrong. Just say it this way. You know, I would edit him in my mind. I remember as a kid listening to my brother or my father and like saying, no, unnecessary phrase. Why are you saying that? So I had these two models, which I feel I successfully merged. And if you are, and into the reasonably articulate person I am now.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, Conrad.
Well, Malcolm, thank you so much for such a generous sharing of your time and words of wisdom. I'm going to ask all the students to give you a rousing applause, and also enjoy your run after this podcast. And
I will.
And thank you again. It's been just great.
Good. Thank you all, guys. Bye.
Yeah, Malcolm.
Thank you, Malcolm.